Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The sensor grid lit up at 0217, 3 pings in sequence. Delta 7, Delta 9, Delta 12, spaced exactly 4 minutes apart. I was already rolling when Alden Qualls came over the radio, his voice flat with the kind of tired professionalism that comes from too many false alarms. "Thatcher, you seeing this pattern?" he asked, and I told him I was halfway there, cutting south on the access road with my headlights off, letting the moonlight guide me through the creosote flats. The desert was bone white under a 3/4 moon. Shadows pooled black beneath the mesquite and Palo Verde, and the wind had died completely, leaving that particular kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. I'd been working this sector for 3 years, knew every wash and ridge, every cattle trail that doubled as a smuggling route, and something about the spacing of those sensor hits felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Not random, not the usual pattern of a group moving north. Too deliberate, too measured, like someone was testing the system, learning its rhythm. I cut the engine a 1/4 mile from Delta 9 and went on foot, carrying my thermal scope and keeping low along the ridgeline where the saguaros stood like silent sentinels. The terrain here was classic Sonoran. Hard-packed sand studded with cholla and brittlebush. Occasional outcrops of volcanic rock that could hide a man if he knew what he was doing. I'd done sign cutting in this area dozens of times, mostly picking up groups of 8 to 12 moving fast, traveling light, following trails established over decades. But when I reached the spot where Delta 9 should have triggered, I found something that stopped me cold. The footprints were there, clear as day, in the soft sand near a dried arroyo, except they weren't footprints at all. They were impressions, perfectly formed, but arranged in a grid pattern that extended maybe 20 feet in each direction, each print exactly 18 inches from the next, creating a lattice of false tracks that led nowhere. Someone had taken the time to press these into the sand, one by one, with what looked like an actual boot sole attached to some kind of stamp or frame. The spacing was too perfect, the depth too uniform. I keyed my radio and told Alden what I was seeing, and there was a long pause before he said, "Say again?" I described it twice, walking the perimeter of the grid with my flashlight, and Alden told me to hold position while he checked with the station, see if anyone had reported training exercises or interdiction drills in this sector. But I knew there hadn't been any. I would have been notified, would have seen it on the patrol schedule. I took photos with my phone, measuring the grid with my bootlaces, and that's when I noticed the stones. Small cairns, each about 8 inches high, positioned at the 4 corners of the lattice. Not natural formations, deliberately stacked, and each cairn had a single stone painted white on top, catching the moonlight like tiny beacons. I felt the hair on my neck stand up, that primal warning system that tells you you're being observed, and I did a full 360 scan with my thermal scope, sweeping the ridges and washes. Nothing. Just the cool blue-black of desert night and the faint heat signatures of small animals moving through the brush. Alden came back on the radio and said the station had no record of anything scheduled. And did I want backup? I told him not yet, told him I was going to check Delta 7 and Delta 12, see if they matched this pattern. Delta 7 was a mile northwest, up a steep alluvial fan that emptied into a box canyon. I took my time getting there, moving tactically, stopping every 50 yards to listen and watch. The desert had that particular quality of stillness that comes just before dawn, when even the coyotes have gone quiet and the air seems to hold its breath. I found the same thing at Delta 7. Another grid of false prints, another set of cairns, but this time there was something else. In the center of the lattice, someone had arranged a series of reflective strips, the kind you'd find on traffic cones or safety vests, forming a pattern I couldn't immediately understand. I stood there for a full minute, staring at it, and then I realized what it was. A map, not of roads or trails, but of sensor positions. Our sensor positions. The strips marked Delta 7, Delta 9, and Delta 12, along with 3 others I recognized, Delta 4, Delta 15, and Delta 18. All of them in this sector, all of them forming a rough pentagon when you connected them. Someone had mapped our detection grid and left it here for me to find, laid out in reflective tape that would only be visible at night, only if you were standing in exactly the right spot. I called it in immediately, and this time Alden's voice had lost its casual edge. He said he was rolling my way with another unit, ETA 15 minutes, and I should sit tight and maintain observation. But I couldn't just sit there. Delta 12 was only half a mile southeast, down in a wash where the mesquite grew thick and the ground stayed soft year-round, perfect for tracking. I told Alden I was moving to Delta 12, would hold there until he arrived, and I started down the slope, keeping my thermal scope up and my sidearm loose in its holster. The wash was darker than the open desert, the mesquite branches forming a canopy that blocked the moonlight, and I had to use my flashlight to navigate the uneven ground. I found Delta 12's lattice right where I expected it, but this one was different. Bigger, maybe 30 feet across, and the footprints weren't just pressed into the sand, they were filled with something. I knelt down and touched one with my gloved hand, and the substance was granular, slightly damp, with a chemical smell I couldn't place. Not sand, not dirt. Something artificial, something that caught the light from my flashlight and glittered faintly, like crushed glass or metallic powder. And that's when I saw the marks on the mesquite trunks. Scratches, carved into the bark at regular intervals, forming lines and symbols I didn't recognize. Not gang tags, not the usual territorial markings you'd see from smuggling organizations. These were older looking, deeper, carved with something sharp and wielded with purpose. I traced them with my light, following the pattern from tree to tree, and they formed a trail leading away from the wash, heading due east toward a low ridge. I knew I should wait for backup, knew every protocol said to hold position and not pursue alone. But something about those markings pulled at me, a compulsion I can't fully explain even now. They felt personal, like they'd been left specifically for me to follow, and I found myself walking that trail, my flashlight beam dancing over the carved symbols, my radio silent on my hip because I didn't want to explain what I was doing, didn't want to hear Alden tell me to stand down. The trail led me up onto the ridge, through a gap in the rock where the stone had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and flash floods, and when I emerged on the other side, I found myself looking down into a shallow basin maybe 100 yards across. And there, spread across the basin floor, was another lattice. But this one wasn't made of footprints. It was made of light. Dozens of small LED lamps, the kind you'd use for camping or emergency signals, arranged in the same grid pattern I'd seen at the sensor sites, each one blinking in sequence, creating a rippling effect that moved across the basin like a wave. I stood there at the ridge top, completely exposed, and watched that pattern repeat itself 3 times before I realized what I was looking at. It was a mirror. The lights were positioned to match the sensor grid, and they were blinking in the same sequence as the sensors themselves. Delta 7, Delta 9, Delta 12, over and over, a perfect echo of the detections I'd been chasing all night. Someone had been watching our sensors, had learned their positions and their timing, and had built this elaborate display to show me they knew, to show me they'd been studying us while we thought we were studying them. I keyed my radio with shaking hands and told Alden to get here now. Told him I'd found something he needed to see, but before I could give him coordinates, the lights went out. All of them simultaneously plunging the basin into darkness so complete I couldn't see my own boots. I fumbled for my flashlight, thumbed it on, and swept the beam across the basin, but the lights were gone. Not just off, gone. No LED lamps, no wiring, no stakes or markers. Just bare sand and scattered rock, as if they'd never been there at all. I did a full scan with my thermal scope and picked up nothing. No residual heat signatures, no movement, just the cold emptiness of pre-dawn desert. My radio crackled, and Alden said, "Thatcher, you copy? What's your 20? And I realized I couldn't answer him. I didn't know where I was. The ridge, the gap in the rocks, the trail of carved symbols, I could see them behind me, could trace the route I'd taken to get here. But when I checked my GPS, it showed me half a mile from where I should have been, as if I'd walked in a direction that shouldn't exist. I made my way back to the wash, following my own tracks in reverse, and found Alden waiting at Delta 12 with his vehicle idling and his spotlight sweeping the mesquite. He looked relieved when I emerged from the darkness, asked me what the hell I'd been doing, why I'd gone off comms for 20 minutes. I told him it had only been 5, maybe 6 minutes at most, and he showed me his watch. 03:45. I'd left the wash at 3:20. The math didn't work, didn't fit the time I'd experienced, but I couldn't argue with his watch or my own exhausted legs that said I'd been walking far longer than I realized. We examined the lattice together, and Alden bagged a sample of the granular substance filling the footprints. Said he'd send it to the lab in Tucson, see what came back. The carved symbols on the mesquite trunks were still there, still visible, but when I tried to show him the trail they formed, he couldn't see it. He saw scratches, saw random marks that could have been anything. Animal claws, wind damage, kids with knives. Not a pattern, not a trail, just noise in the data. We swept the area until sunrise, found nothing else of note, and headed back to the station as the sky turned purple and gold over the Growler Mountains. I filed my report, included the photos and GPS coordinates, and expected someone higher up the chain to take an interest, maybe send out an investigative team, or coordinate with local law enforcement. But nothing happened. The lab results came back inconclusive. The granular substance was a mixture of silica, mica, and trace amounts of lithium. Nothing illegal or particularly unusual for desert soil. The photos I'd taken of the lattice patterns were logged and filed, and a memo came down from Sector Command noting possible surveillance activity and recommending increased patrols in the affected grid. Alden and I pulled extra shifts for the next week, running the same routes, checking the same sensors, finding nothing. The lattices were gone, erased by wind or deliberately removed, and the carved symbols on the mesquite had faded or been covered by fresh growth. It was as if the whole thing had been staged for that one night, for my benefit alone, and now that I'd seen it, the performance was over. But the sensors kept pinging. Not Delta 7, Delta 9, Delta 12, those went quiet. Almost too quiet, as if whatever had been testing them had learned what it needed to learn. No, the new pings came from different sectors, different grids, always in that same measured sequence, 4 minutes apart, forming patterns I started recognizing. Lattices, echoes, mirrors. Other agents reported finding strange tracks, irregular formations, cairns arranged in geometries that didn't match human or animal movement. Station Command attributed it to organized smuggling operations, said the cartels were getting sophisticated, using decoys and false trails to pull our resources away from real crossings. And maybe that was true. Maybe that's all it was. But I remembered standing on that ridge, watching lights blink in perfect synchrony with our own sensors, feeling the weight of observation from somewhere I couldn't see. and I knew it was more than smuggling tactics. Someone, or something, had been studying us with a patience and precision that went beyond narco-strategy, mapping not just our physical grid, but our patterns of response, our decision trees, the way we thought about the desert and our place in it. I ran into Maria Valverde about a month later, at a checkpoint briefing with local ranch liaisons. She worked for one of the big cattle operations that held grazing leases across the border zone. Spent most of her time riding fence lines and checking water tanks, knew the desert as well as anyone. We got to talking after the briefing, and I mentioned the lattices, keeping it vague, just asking if she'd seen anything unusual in her patrols. Her face changed when I described the grid patterns, the careful spacing, and she got very quiet. She said she had seen them, or something like them, back in the 80s when she was just starting out, before the border buildup and the sensor nets and all the technology we take for granted now. She'd found them in remote areas, always near water sources or traditional crossing routes, always arranged with that same geometric precision. She'd reported it to the old border patrol officers, the ones who'd worked the line back when it was just dirt roads and binoculars, and they'd told her to forget about it. Said it was probably just old survey markers or archaeological sites, nothing to worry about. But she remembered the feeling of being watched when she found them, remembered how her horse would refuse to go near certain areas, how the cattle would avoid patches of ground for no visible reason. "Did you ever figure out what they were?" I asked, and Maria gave me a look I couldn't quite read, something between sympathy and warning. "No," she said. "But I learned not to follow the patterns. They're not meant for us, Thatcher. They're breadcrumbs, and if you follow them far enough, you end up somewhere you can't get back from." I asked her what she meant by that, but she just shook her head and said she needed to get back to her truck, had fence repairs waiting. I watched her drive away, dust plume rising behind her tires, and I thought about the basin with the lights, about the 25 minutes I couldn't account for, about my GPS putting me somewhere I shouldn't have been. I thought about how easy it would be to walk a little farther next time, to follow the trail just one more ridge over, to try to find the source of the patterns instead of just documenting them and moving on. I haven't found another lattice since that night. My sector has been quiet, unusually so, with crossing numbers down and sensor activity minimal. Alden got transferred to a different station, took a promotion that moved him up to Yuma sector, and I've been riding solo more often than not, covering twice the ground with half the backup. I still do my patrols, still run the grid, but I've started noticing things I didn't before. The way certain rock formations seem to shift position between visits, never dramatically, just enough to make me question my memory. The way my vehicle's odometer doesn't always match the distance I think I've traveled, showing extra miles or sometimes fewer, as if the desert itself is elastic, stretching and contracting around me. Small things, easily dismissed as fatigue or equipment error, but they accumulate, building a weight I carry on every shift. Last week I was running a night patrol near Delta 18, the easternmost sensor in that old Pentagon pattern, and I found a single cairn sitting in the middle of the access road. Just one, 4 stones high, with a white-painted rock on top. It hadn't been there on my pass 3 hours earlier. I was certain of that, and there were no tracks around it, no indication of how it had appeared. I sat in my vehicle for a long time, engine idling, headlights illuminating that small pile of stones, and I thought about getting out and kicking it over, scattering the rocks and erasing whatever message it was meant to convey. But I didn't. I drove around it, gave it a wide berth, and continued my patrol as if I hadn't seen it. And when I came back through 2 hours later, it was gone. No rocks, no disturbance in the dust, nothing. Just empty road and the endless darkness of the desert pressing in from all sides. I know what Maria meant now about the breadcrumbs. They're still being left, still forming patterns I can almost but not quite understand, and the temptation to follow them gets stronger every time I find a new piece. The lattices weren't random, weren't meant to confuse or misdirect. They were an invitation, or maybe a test, and I passed by not following them all the way to their conclusion. But passing isn't the same as winning, and I'm starting to realize that whatever created those patterns is patient, far more patient than any human organization, and it's still out there in the dark spaces between sensors. Still watching, still waiting for the night when curiosity or duty or simple exhaustion will pull me off the mapped trails and into the spaces where the geometry changes, where time moves differently, where the desert keeps its oldest secrets. I filed another report last week, documenting the cairn and its disappearance, and it went into the same folder as all my previous reports. Unread or dismissed as stress-related pattern recognition, the mind's tendency to find meaning in random data. Maybe that's all it is. Maybe I'm just another burned-out agent seeing conspiracies in the dust, turning routine smuggling countermeasures into something larger and more sinister because the alternative, that this job is just an endless cycle of empty desert and false alarms, is too depressing to accept. But I don't think so. I think the lattices are still out there, reforming themselves in sectors I haven't reached yet, waiting to be discovered by someone who will make a different choice than I did, who'll follow the trail all the way down and learn what's at the center of the pattern. And I think about that possibility every night when I roll out of the station, heading into darkness with nothing but my headlights and radio to keep me connected to the world I know, wondering if tonight will be the night I find another grid, another set of lights, another trail leading somewhere my GPS can't map. The desert doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive, and it sure as hell doesn't reveal its patterns to those who aren't willing to pay the price of understanding them. I learned that much at least. What I haven't learned, what I'm not sure I want to learn, is what that price actually is, and whether I've already started paying it without realizing. The lattices knew where I'd be before I did, knew which sensors would draw my attention, knew how to arrange themselves in ways that would feel personal, significant, impossible to ignore. They were made for me, or for someone like me, and even though I walked away, even though I didn't follow them to their source, I can't shake the feeling that by seeing them, by documenting them, by carrying their patterns in my memory, I've become part of whatever larger design they represent, a point in a grid I can't perceive, a sensor registering movements I'll never fully understand, a marker in someone else's lattice waiting to be connected to the next point in the sequence. And some nights, when the radio is quiet and the desert spreads out before me like a vast geometric problem I'm meant to solve, I wonder if I'm still really patrolling this sector, or if I've already slipped into one of those spaces where the rules change, where 4 minutes can become 25 and 100 yards can bend into half a mile, where the only way out is to follow the pattern to its conclusion and hope there's something recognizable waiting on the other side. But I never do. I stay on the roads, stick to the grid, document and report and patrol until my shift ends and I can hand the sector over to the next agent. Let them carry the weight for a while. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all I can do. Keep moving. Keep watching. Keep pretending I don't see the new cairns appearing in my peripheral vision. Don't notice the way certain stars seem to blink in sequence when I'm far enough from artificial light. Don't feel the pressure of observation from the ridge lines and washes where the lattices wait, patient and precise, ready to teach their lessons to whoever proves willing or foolish enough to learn them. The desert is patient. It has all the time in the world. And I'm just one more agent walking its grids, following my assigned routes, marking time until the patterns decide they're done with me and move on to someone else. Or until I decide I'm done being watched and finally take that first step off the mapped trails, following the breadcrumbs down into the geometry of stones and light and missing time, accepting the invitation that's been waiting since that first night at Delta 7, Delta 9, Delta 12, when I learned that some tracks don't lead anywhere the maps can follow, and some trails only go one direction, and there's no way to know which ones are which until you're already too far in to turn back. The sensor grid is quiet tonight. I'm sitting in my vehicle at the junction of two access roads, engine off, watching the empty desert under a moonless sky, and I'm thinking about lattices and cairns and the spaces between points on a grid, thinking about the 25 minutes I lost and the distances that don't add up, thinking about Maria Valverde and the look in her eyes when she told me not to follow the patterns. And I'm thinking about the fact that Delta 7, Delta 9, and Delta 12 have been completely silent for 3 months now. No pings at all, as if they'd been switched off or removed from the network. But I checked them last week during a daylight patrol, and they're still there, still functional, still wired into the grid. They're just not detecting anything anymore. And I wonder if that's because there's nothing left to detect in those sectors, or if it's because whatever was triggering them has learned to move through our sensors without being seen, has mapped the grid so thoroughly that it can flow through the gaps like water through stone, invisible to our technology, present in the spaces we've marked as secure. That thought should terrify me more than it does. Instead, it just makes me tired, a deep exhaustion that's become permanent somewhere in my bones, the weight of knowing there are patterns I'll never fully understand and questions I should probably stop asking. But I keep asking anyway, because that's the job, that's what they pay me for, and because some part of me, some stubborn, curious, probably self-destructive part, needs to know what's at the center of the lattice, even if knowing costs me more than I'm prepared to pay. The radio crackles to life. Station, calling for a routine check, and I key the mic and give them my call sign and position. My voice steady and professional, betraying nothing of what I'm thinking. They acknowledge and go off air, and I'm alone again in the darkness, watching the empty desert and waiting for something to move, something to trigger the sensors, something to give me a reason to roll out and start following tracks. But the grid stays quiet, and the night deepens, and somewhere out in that vast expanse of sand and stone and silence, the lattices are waiting, patient as stars, ready to reform themselves when the time is right, when the next agent drives into the right sector at the right moment and finds the breadcrumbs arranged in patterns they can't quite resist following. Maybe it'll be me again. Maybe it'll be someone else. Either way, the desert keeps its patterns, and the patterns keep their secrets, and those of us who walk the line between them just keep moving, keep watching, keep carrying the weight of all the things we've seen and can't explain and aren't allowed to forget, no matter how much easier it would be if we could. The fog came in around midnight, rolling off the Rio Grande like something alive, thick enough to turn my spotlight into a useless cone of white glare that revealed nothing beyond 10 feet. I was posted at observation point 17, a cut in the levee that gave a good view of a half-mile stretch of river during clear nights. But tonight there was no view at all, just that dense wall of mist that swallowed sound and turned the familiar terrain into something foreign and unknowable. Elijah Vandergriff was running boat patrol 2 miles downstream, his voice crackling over the radio every 20 minutes with position updates and visibility reports, each one worse than the last. "I'm dead blind down here, Creed," he said around 00:45. "Can't see the banks, can't see my own bow. Gonna hold position till this clears." I told him that was smart, that I wasn't seeing anything worth reporting from my position either, and we settled into that particular kind of waiting that defines border work, alert but patient, ready for action that probably won't come, watching emptiness for signs of movement that might never appear. The first light showed up at 01:15, A brief flicker maybe 200 yards downriver, visible through the fog as a diffuse yellow glow that lasted 3 or 4 seconds before winking out. I marked the time and position in my log, keyed my radio to alert Elijah, but he cut me off before I could speak. "Yeah, I saw it," he said. "About 200 meters north of my 20. You seeing more?" I told him not yet, and we both went quiet, watching. The second light appeared 5 minutes later. Same distance downriver from my position. Same yellow glow, same brief duration. Then a third and a fourth, each one spaced exactly 5 minutes and 200 yards apart, creating a sequence that moved steadily south along the river like something being passed from hand to hand. Signal lights, I thought. Crossing party communicating positions, coordinating a pickup or a cash drop. It was textbook cartel procedure, nothing I hadn't seen a dozen times before, and I started calling it in to station command when the pattern broke. The fifth light didn't appear where it should have, 200 yards down from the fourth. Instead, it showed up on the opposite bank, directly across from my observation point, close enough that I could see it was sitting on what looked like a small raft or float, something just barely visible through the fog as a dark irregular shape on the water. I trained my binoculars on it, trying to make out details, and the light went out immediately, as if whoever was controlling it had seen me looking. Elijah came on the radio, his voice tighter now, professional calm starting to crack. "Creed, you got eyes on that one? Because it just popped up right next to my boat, and I mean right next to maybe 20 feet off my starboard side. Close enough I could hear it breathing." I felt my scalp tighten, asked him what he meant by breathing, and there was a long pause before he responded. "I don't know what I mean, but something's in the water near that light. Something big enough to make waves when it moves. I'm seeing displacement, seeing ripples that don't match the current." I told him to stay put, said I was calling for backup and moving to his position, but before I could reach for the radio, the light appeared again, this time on my side of the river, halfway between the bank and my observation point, sitting in the middle of the levee road like someone had just walked up and set it there. It was a camping lantern, the old-style battery-powered kind with a wire handle, and it was sitting upright on the gravel with its beam pointed straight up into the fog, creating a column of illumination that rose maybe 30 feet before dissipating into the mist. I approached it slowly, hand on my sidearm, scanning the area with my flashlight for tracks or movement, finding neither. The ground around the lantern was undisturbed, no footprints in the soft gravel, no tire marks, no indication anyone had been there at all. I circled it twice, keeping my distance, and that's when I noticed the items. 3 of them, arranged in a neat line leading away from the lantern toward the river. A plastic water bottle, empty and crushed flat. A child's shoe, small and worn, the kind you'd find in any discount store along the border. And a laminated prayer card, the type with a saint's image on one side and a prayer in Spanish on the other. They were spaced about 6 feet apart, forming a trail that ended at the riverbank where the fog was thickest, and each item was positioned with its longest axis pointing due south, creating a directional marker that couldn't be accidental. I photographed everything with my phone, documented the positions and the sequence, and then I heard Elijah's voice on the radio, urgent and low. "Creed, I got more lights. Dozens of them, all around my position, all in the water. They're moving." I asked him which direction, and he said all of them. Said the lights were circling his boat in a pattern he couldn't predict, appearing and disappearing at random intervals, never staying lit long enough for him to get a bearing. Station command came on the line, Rihanna Talmadge's voice cutting through with crisp authority, asking for sit-reps and coordinates. I gave her my position and what I'd found, and she told me to secure the evidence and hold for backup units, said she had 2 agents rolling from the checkpoint and a Border Patrol helicopter on standby if the fog lifted enough for flight ops. Eliah's voice came back. Steadier now, but with an edge I'd never heard from him before. "Supervisor, I need to move. These lights, they're not random. They're forming shapes, patterns. I'm seeing geometry in this, seeing organization, and I don't think it's human." Rihanna told him to clarify that last statement, and Eliah went silent for a moment before responding. "The lights are arranged in circles, concentric circles that are contracting toward my position. It's like they're herding me, pushing me toward the bank. And the timing, Supervisor, the timing is too precise. Each light appears for exactly 3 seconds, then goes dark for exactly 5, and they're doing it in sequence, moving clockwise around my position at a constant rate. That's not smugglers coordinating a crossing. That's something else." I looked down at the lantern still glowing at my feet, at the trail of items leading to the water, and I realized Eliah was right. The 5-minute intervals between the initial lights, the exact spacing, the deliberate placement of the evidence I'd found, it was all too measured, too calculated to be human improvisation under operational stress. Whoever or whatever was running these lights had planned this down to the second, had mapped our positions and our response patterns, and was now executing a scenario we didn't understand. I started moving toward Eliah's last reported position, following the levee road south with my vehicle's spotlight sweeping the fog, calling out my movement on the radio so command could track me. The trail of items continued, more of them appearing every 100 yards or so. Another water bottle, another shoe, this one an adult size, another prayer card, then a torn piece of fabric that might have been from a backpack, then an empty food wrapper with the label in Spanish, then a small plastic toy still bright despite the mud caked on it. Each item perfectly placed, each one pointing south, each one part of a breadcrumb trail that led me deeper into the fog and closer to the river. I picked up the toy, turned it over in my hand, and felt something I can only describe as profound wrongness emanating from it. Not in any supernatural sense, I've never believed in that kind of thing, but in the sense that this object had no business being here, arranged with such care, part of a display that served no practical purpose I could identify. If you're crossing the river and you need to travel light, you don't stop every 100 yards to arrange evidence in neat lines. You move fast, stay invisible, leave as little trace as possible. This was the opposite of that. This was conspicuous, intentional, designed to be found and followed. Eliah's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp with controlled panic. "Creed, they're touching the boat. The lights, they're against the hull now, and I can feel impacts, like something's bumping into me from underneath. Multiple somethings." I asked if he was seeing anything in the water, any shapes or movement, and he said no, said the fog was too thick and the lights were too bright, destroying his night vision whenever he looked directly at them. Rihanna came back on the radio and ordered him to start his engine and move to the designated extraction point. Coordinates she'd transmitted to his GPS, and I heard the sound of an outboard motor grinding to life over the radio, followed by Eliah cursing. "Engines flooded, won't turn over. I'm trying again." The motor whined and died, and Eliah's breathing got faster over the open channel. "Supervisor, I'm dead in the water, literally, and these lights are getting closer." I pushed my vehicle faster, fog lamps cutting dim tunnels through the mist, and almost ran over the next item in the trail. A backpack, the real thing this time, not empty like the others, but stuffed full and sitting in the middle of the road with its zippers open and its contents spilling out. I stopped hard, tires sliding on gravel, and got out to investigate. The pack was new, maybe a few weeks old at most, with no signs of weathering or long-term exposure. Inside I found clothes, all neatly folded, all in children's sizes. along with 3 more water bottles, these ones full, a first aid kit still sealed in its plastic wrapper, and a hand-drawn map on notebook paper showing a section of the river with various points marked in blue ink. I recognized the landmarks. This was the stretch I was patrolling, the area between my observation point and Elia's boat position, and the marks on the map corresponded to the locations where I'd found the items. Someone had planted this trail deliberately, had marked each drop point on a map, and then executed the placement with precision, knowing that any agent finding the first few items would feel compelled to follow the sequence, would keep moving south along the levee road until they reached… what? The map showed one final mark, a red X drawn at a bend in the river about 300 yards ahead of my current position, with a note in Spanish scrawled next to it. Aquí termina el camino. Here the path ends. I studied that notation for a long moment, weighing my options, and Elia's voice broke through again, calmer now, but with an undercurrent of resignation that scared me more than his earlier panic. Creed, I'm seeing them now. The things with the lights. They're not people. They're not anything I can identify. Just shapes in the fog, moving through the water in formation, and they're carrying the lanterns like they're tools, like they know what they're doing. I'm going to try the engine one more time, and if it doesn't start, I'm abandoning the boat and swimming for the bank. You should know that, in case this goes wrong. Rihanna's voice came back immediately, ordering him to hold position. Backup was inbound. ETA 7 minutes. But I knew 7 minutes might as well be 7 hours in this situation. I got back in my vehicle and drove toward the red X, toward the bend in the river where the path ended, and I wondered what I'd find there. What final piece of this elaborate display had been arranged for whoever followed the trail all the way to its conclusion. The bend came into view gradually, the levee road curving west to follow the river's course, and the fog seemed to thin slightly here, as if something about the terrain or the water flow created a pocket of clearer air. I could see the river itself now, black and slow-moving, its surface reflecting the ambient light from my vehicle in long, oily streaks. And I could see the lights. Dozens of them, maybe more, scattered across the water in that same geometric pattern Elia had described. Concentric circles that pulsed in sequence, creating a rippling effect that moved from the outer rings toward a central point where something large and dark floated just beneath the surface. I stopped the vehicle, killed the engine, and got out slowly, my hand on my sidearm more from instinct than any real belief it would help. The lights continued their pattern, 3 seconds on and 5 seconds off, moving clockwise around that central point with mechanical precision, and I realized I was looking at something that had been arranged not for tactical advantage or practical purpose but as communication, as a message conveyed through geometry and timing that I was clearly meant to witness and interpret. I walked to the riverbank, picking my way carefully through the rocks and brush, and when I reached the water's edge I saw what was at the center of the circles. A raft, or what remained of one, wooden planks lashed together with rope, barely buoyant, listing heavily to one side and taking on water through gaps in its construction. And on the raft, arranged in the same neat line as the items I'd been following all night, were personal effects. Wallets, IDs, photographs, all sealed in plastic bags to protect them from the water, all positioned with care and tagged with small waterproof labels that gave names and dates. I waded in knee-deep, the cold river current pulling at my boots, and retrieved the nearest bag. Inside was a Mexican voter ID, a family photograph showing 4 people standing in front of a small house, and a handwritten note on lined paper that said in English, "We tried to cross on March 17th. The river was higher than we expected. We did not make it. But we left these things so someone would know we were here." The date on the note was March 17th of this year, 7 months ago, The date on the voter ID matched. I looked at the photograph, at the faces of people I'd never met and would never meet now, and I felt a weight settle into my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding. This wasn't a smuggling operation or a cartel tactic. This was a memorial, a deliberate act of remembrance carried out by survivors or family members who wanted to ensure that those who'd been lost to the river weren't simply erased, weren't just numbers in a report or unidentified remains in a county morgue. The lights, the trail of items, the careful arrangement of evidence, it was all designed to lead someone here, to make them see these personal effects and acknowledge the lives they represented. And the precision of the timing, the geometric patterns, those were simply the methodology of people who understood that border agents respond to patterns, to sequences, to signs of organization and intent. They'd built a trail that mimicked our own operational procedures, that spoke to us in the language of detection and pursuit, knowing that once we started following it, we'd feel compelled to reach the end. I photographed everything, documented each item on the raft, and then I heard Eliah's engine cough to life over the radio, sputtering but functional, and his voice came through with palpable relief. "Engine's running. I'm mobile. Moving to extraction point now." Rihanna acknowledged, told him to maintain radio contact, and asked me for a status update. I described what I'd found, the raft and the memorial and the personal effects, and there was a long silence before she responded. "Creed, backup units are 3 minutes out. Secure the evidence and stand by for recovery team. We'll need to document this properly, coordinate with Mexican authorities if the IDs trace back to reported missing persons." I told her I understood, but I was still standing in the river, still looking at the raft and the bags of memories arrayed on its surface, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that there was another layer to this I hadn't perceived yet. The lights started going out, one by one, the circles collapsing inward until only a single lantern remained lit. This one, sitting on the Mexican side of the river maybe 50 yards upstream from my position. It burned steady and bright, no longer following the 3-on-5 off pattern, just a constant beacon marking a point on the opposite bank. I watched it for a full minute, trying to decide if I should cross, or call it in, or simply wait for backup. And that's when I saw the figures. 3 of them, standing on the far bank near the light, visible now that the fog was lifting, silhouetted against the faint pre-dawn glow in the eastern sky. They weren't moving, weren't doing anything threatening, just standing there in a line watching me across the water. I raised my flashlight and aimed the beam at them, and they didn't react, didn't flee or hide or signal. Just stood there, patient and still, and I understood that they were the ones who'd built this trail, who'd placed the items and arranged the lights and guided me to this spot. Family members maybe, or friends, or just people who felt responsible for ensuring that those who died in the crossing weren't forgotten. I raised my hand in a wave, a simple acknowledgement across the water, and after a moment one of the figures raised their hand in return. Then they turned and walked away from the bank, disappearing into the brush, and the final light went out, leaving me standing in darkness with the sound of my backup units approaching from the north, their sirens cutting through the residual fog, their headlights sweeping the levee road in steady arcs. I waded back to the bank, my boots squishing with river water, and climbed up to meet the first vehicle as it pulled to a stop. The agent driving was someone I knew from the station, a 10-year veteran named Marcus who'd seen enough border operations to take most things in stride. But even he looked unsettled when I showed him the raft and explained what I'd found. "That's a new one," he said quietly, and I agreed that it was, that in 3 years of working this sector I'd never encountered anything quite like this systematic, carefully constructed memorial designed to force us to bear witness. The recovery team arrived at dawn, pulling the raft from the water and cataloging its contents, matching IDs to missing persons reports and coordinating with Mexican authorities to notify families. The items I'd found along the trail were collected as evidence, bagged and tagged and transported back to the station for processing, and I spent the rest of my shift writing reports and answering questions from supervisors who were trying to determine if this constituted some kind of operational security breach or was simply an unusually elaborate act of remembrance. The consensus eventually was the latter, that we'd stumbled onto a private memorial, that the lights and the trail had been meant for us, but not as a threat, just as a way of ensuring that someone in authority would see and document what had been lost. The case was referred to our victim identification unit, and I was told to resume normal patrols, that this was a one-time event and not something that required ongoing investigation. But it wasn't a one-time event. 2 weeks later, Elia reported finding another trail of items along a different stretch of river, this one leading to a second raft with different names and dates, but the same careful arrangement of personal effects. A month after that, another agent in a neighboring sector found a similar setup, complete with the geometric light patterns and the timed sequences that mimicked our operational procedures. And then another and another, until it became clear that this was an organized effort, a network of memorials being constructed along the entire length of the border in South Texas, each one designed to draw agents to specific locations and force them to confront the human cost of the crossings we spent our nights preventing. Command tried to get ahead of it, put out directives about not following unidentified trails and not engaging with potential lures, but the reality was that we couldn't ignore them. Every trail represented people who'd died trying to cross. Every raft held evidence that might bring closure to families still searching for missing loved ones. And our job, our actual job, beneath all the enforcement and detention statistics, was to protect human life on both sides of the border, which meant we had to respond when these memorials appeared. I've followed 5 more trails since that first night, each one leading to a raft or a carefully arranged site with personal effects and dates and names. Each time, I've seen figures on the opposite bank watching as I documented the evidence, making sure I saw everything, making sure the memorial served its purpose. I don't know who they are specifically, whether they're family members or smugglers with a conscience, or simply people who live along the border and feel a responsibility to mark the losses. But I've come to understand that the lights and the patterns aren't threats. They're appeals, requests for acknowledgement from people who know we're the only ones who regularly patrol these areas, who have the authority and the resources to ensure that these deaths get recorded and investigated, rather than simply dissolving into the anonymity of the river. It's an uncomfortable position to be in, being drafted as witnesses to tragedies we couldn't prevent, being made complicit in a memorial process that exists outside official channels and operational procedures. But I do it anyway, because the alternative, ignoring the trails, letting the rafts drift away unmarked, feels like a betrayal of something fundamental, something that transcends the political arguments and enforcement priorities and makes this job about more than just statistics and apprehensions. Elia transferred out 3 months ago, took a position with the Marine Unit in California sector where the work is different and the river crossings less frequent. We talked before he left, comparing notes on the memorials we'd each encountered, trying to make sense of the organizational structure behind them. They know our patrol patterns, he said. They know our response times, our procedures where we stage our units and how we coordinate operations. That takes observation, takes time and patience and a level of familiarity with our operations that's honestly impressive. But they're not using that knowledge to run drugs or people. They're using it to make us see what usually stays invisible. I asked him if that bothered him, the idea that we were being watched and studied so thoroughly, and he shook his head. Not the way it would if they were hostile. This is different. This is just documentation. They're documenting the costs, and they're making sure we participate in that documentation whether we want to or not. I can't really be mad about that. I think about that conversation sometimes when I'm running my patrols, watching the river flow past in its eternal slow dance toward the Gulf, wondering where the next trail will appear and what names I'll find at its end. The fog comes in most nights now, thick and persistent, and the lights show up regularly, forming their geometric patterns and leading me to new rafts, new personal effects, new evidence of losses that might otherwise have gone unrecorded. Station Command has stopped treating these as unusual events, has integrated them into our regular operational procedures with standardized documentation forms and notification protocols. We're memorial witnesses now, as much as we are enforcement agents, and that dual role creates a tension I haven't fully resolved. But I keep following the trails when they appear, keep wading into the river to retrieve the rafts, keep photographing the IDs and the letters and the family photos that get left for me to find. Because someone needs to see them. Someone needs to ensure that these people existed and tried and failed and deserve to be remembered, and on this particular stretch of border, in this particular moment, that someone is me. The fog is rolling in again as I write this, settling over the Rio Grande like a blanket, and I can see the first lights beginning to appear downstream, their yellow glow diffused and softened by the mist, their timing already falling into that familiar 3-on-5 off pattern that means another trail is being laid out for me to follow. I'll give it 15 minutes, let the sequence complete itself, and then I'll start tracking the items from my observation point toward whatever destination has been selected for tonight's memorial. I'll document what I find, I'll notify the appropriate authorities, and I'll watch the figures on the opposite bank acknowledge my presence before they fade back into the darkness. And then I'll return to my position and wait for the next trail, the next sequence of lights, the next carefully constructed appeal for witness that I'm being asked to honor. The river keeps flowing, the memorials keep appearing, and those of us who work this line keep walking the space between enforcement and remembrance, trying to do justice to both roles even when they pull in opposite directions. Some nights I wonder if the people building these memorials understand the position they're putting us in, the way they're forcing us to see aspects of this work that are easier to ignore, to confront the human costs that exist beneath the operational statistics and mission objectives. Other nights, I think they understand perfectly that forcing us to see is exactly the point, that by making us bear witness, they're ensuring that we can't maintain the comfortable distance that makes this job sustainable over the long term. Either way, I keep showing up, keep following the lights when they appear, keep my part of this unspoken agreement between the watchers and the watched, the documenters and the documented. The border is a stage for more dramas than just the ones officially recognized, and the fog that rolls off the river each night carries more than just moisture. It carries memory, carries loss, carries the names of people who tried to cross and didn't make it, and deserve to have their attempts acknowledged even if their success wasn't possible. The lights are forming their circles now, contracting toward a central point downstream, and I can see the outline of another raft beginning to take shape in the dim glow. I check my radio, confirm my position with Station Command, and start walking toward the water, following a trail that I know will lead me to more names, more faces, more evidence of the border's hidden costs. And when I reach the end, when I've documented everything and watched the figures on the opposite bank confirm that I've seen what they needed me to see, I'll wade back to shore and resume my patrol, carrying the weight of all these memorials I've witnessed, all these names I've recorded, all these appeals for acknowledgement that I couldn't refuse even when procedures suggested I should. The river keeps flowing, the fog keeps rolling in, and the lights keep appearing in their geometric patterns, patient and precise, marking locations where memory intersects with duty and where I've been drafted as a witness to losses I'll never fully understand, but can at least ensure aren't forgotten. That's something, I tell myself as I approach the water's edge and see tonight's raft waiting in its circle of lights. That's more than nothing, and maybe in the end it's enough. Someone had called it in anonymously. A tip phoned into the Border Patrol tip line at 14:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. A woman's voice speaking careful English with a heavy accent, giving coordinates for an abandoned motel off Highway 9 and saying there were people inside who need help. The recording played twice during our briefing, the woman's voice calm and deliberate. Room 7, Room 11, Room 14. They are waiting for someone. They have been waiting a long time. Then she disconnected, and dispatch couldn't trace the call beyond a general cell tower location that covered about 30 square miles of empty New Mexico borderland. Standard procedure was to roll a unit for welfare checks on reports like this, so I drew the assignment along with 2 county deputies and Laurel Penhaligon, the county medic who rode with us on calls that might involve injured migrants or medical emergencies. We reached the motel just after 16:00, the sun still high and brutal, turning the desert into a shimmering expanse of heat waves and white light that made the abandoned building look even more desolate than it probably was. The place had been called the Mesquite Motor Lodge back when Highway 9 still carried regular traffic, before the interstate rerouted commerce 50 miles north and left this stretch of road to slowly die. Now it was just a long L-shaped structure with 14 rooms, their doors painted turquoise that had faded to a sickly green-gray, their windows either boarded over or broken out, their air conditioning units rusted into shapeless lumps that hung from the walls like metal tumors. A sign near the highway still advertised vacancy and color TV and refrigerated air, all promises that had expired decades ago, leaving only the skeletal architecture and the creosote bushes that had grown up through cracks in the parking lot asphalt. The deputies did a perimeter check while I approached the office, a separate building that squatted at the junction of the 2 wings like a watchtower overlooking its domain. The door hung open, revealing a dim interior thick with dust and the smell of animal nesting, and I could see where someone had been inside recently. Fresh boot prints in the dust, leading from the entrance to the back office and then out again through a broken window. Laurel stayed near the vehicles, her medical kit ready, while I moved to room 7, the first one mentioned in the tip. The door was closed but not locked. The jamb splintered where someone had kicked it in years ago and never bothered to repair it. I pushed it open slowly, hand on my sidearm, calling out, "Border Patrol, anyone inside?" to the darkness beyond. No response. Just that particular silence of abandoned spaces, heavy and expectant, like the building was holding its breath. I stepped inside, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness, and found a standard motel room frozen in some indeterminate decade. Bed frame without mattress, dresser with its drawers pulled out and scattered across the floor. Bathroom door standing open to reveal a toilet and sink, both long dry and stained with rust. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained why someone would specifically direct us to this room, until I looked at the walls and saw the writing. It covered every surface, floor to ceiling, written in what looked like marker or crayon in dozens of different hands, different languages, different dates spanning years, or maybe decades. Names and messages and prayers and coordinates, all overlapping in a palimpsest of desperation and hope and fear that had accumulated layer by layer like sediment. I recognized Spanish, obviously, but also indigenous languages I couldn't identify. Some Arabic, some Chinese characters, even what might have been Russian Cyrillic. The dates were what got me, though. They ranged from the 90s all the way up to last month. A continuous record of people passing through this room, leaving their marks, documenting their presence for reasons I couldn't immediately understand. Some messages were simple. Juan Morales, Oaxaca, 15/8/2003. Others were more elaborate, tiny autobiographies compressed into a few sentences, stories of why they were traveling north, who they were leaving behind, what they hoped to find. And some were just coordinates, grid references, and distances and directions, the practical information of survival and navigation reduced to its essential mathematics. I photographed everything, working systematically from one wall to the next, and then I noticed the pattern. Certain names appeared multiple times, written in different locations in the room, but always in the same hand, as if the same person had returned to this place repeatedly and left a fresh mark each time. One name in particular jumped out. Gideon, if you are reading this, room 11 has what you need. It was written in English, in blue marker that looked relatively fresh, maybe a few weeks old, and it was signed with initials I didn't recognize. LV. I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling the temperature in the room drop despite the afternoon heat, feeling that crawling sensation between my shoulder blades that says you're being watched or anticipated or positioned in some larger pattern you can't perceive. My name is Gideon Yarborough, and someone had left a message for me in an abandoned motel room, had known I would be here before I knew it myself, had written my name on a wall and directed me to the next location in a sequence I was apparently meant to follow. I keyed my radio and told the deputies I was moving to room 11, tried to keep my voice level and professional, betraying nothing of the unease that was building in my chest. Laurel asked if I'd found anyone in 7, and I told her no, just writings, just evidence of long-term use as a way station. Room 11 was 3 doors down, its door also hanging open, and when I stepped inside, I found a space that was identical to room 7 in layout, but completely different in content. This room was clean, not naturally clean, not the clean of neglect and slow decay, but actively maintained, swept out, with its surfaces wiped down and its corners free of the debris that accumulated everywhere else in the building. Someone had been caring for this room, treating it differently than the others, preserving it for some purpose that became clearer when I saw what was mounted on the walls. Maps. Dozens of them. Some printed from websites, some hand-drawn, some torn from atlases or road guides, all showing sections of the New Mexico-Mexico border with routes marked in different colors, waypoints circled, distances noted, terrain features annotated with warnings or recommendations. But these weren't smuggling routes, not exactly. They were too detailed, too carefully considered, with notations about water sources and border patrol schedules and safe houses that showed a level of planning that went beyond simple commercial trafficking. These were maps for people who were trying to make it on their own, without coyotes or cartel guides, relying instead on information that had been compiled and shared and updated by successive waves of migrants who'd passed through this room and left their knowledge for those who came after. It was a library, a repository of practical survival information, and it had been maintained over years by people who understood that getting across the border wasn't just about evading detection. It was about navigating a landscape that could kill you if you took a wrong turn, or ran out of water, or got caught in a flash flood, or stepped on a rattlesnake. The maps showed all of that, marked with symbols and codes that took me a while to decipher but eventually resolved into a comprehensive guide to crossing this sector, more detailed and current than anything I'd seen in official channels. I was photographing the third map when I found the message meant for me. It was written on a sticky note attached to a detailed topographic map of the area around the motel, and it said in the same blue marker as the message in room 7. Gideon, room 14 has the names. You'll understand when you see them. The wall behind the bathroom mirror. LV. I stood there, holding that sticky note, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of how someone could have known my name. known I would be assigned to this call, known I would follow the sequence from 7 to 11 to 14. The anonymous tip had come in just hours ago, but these messages looked days or weeks old. Their ink faded slightly, their paper edges curled from temperature changes. Either someone had been planning this for a long time, waiting for the right moment to make the call that would bring me here, or something stranger was happening, something that involved prediction or surveillance or coordination I couldn't begin to understand. I thought about calling it in, bringing Laurel and the deputies into these rooms and showing them what I'd found, but some instinct made me hesitate. This felt personal, directed specifically at me, and involving others before I understood what I was being shown seemed premature, possibly dangerous. Room 14 was at the far end of the second wing, the last door before the building terminated in a chain-link fence that separated the motel property from open desert. The door was locked, the first one I'd encountered that wasn't already standing open or kicked in, and I had to use my Halligan tool to pry it open, the frame splintering with a crack that echoed across the empty parking lot. Laurel called over the radio asking if I was okay, and I told her I was fine, just gaining access would report back shortly. The room beyond the door was dark, its windows not just boarded but sealed with what looked like tar paper and duct tape, blocking every source of external light. I used my flashlight to navigate, sweeping the beam across a space that appeared empty at first glance. No furniture, no debris, just bare walls and floor, and the outline of a bathroom door standing ajar. But the walls weren't actually bare. They were covered in a different kind of writing, visible only under direct light, written in what I realized after a moment was glow-in-the-dark paint, the kind that needs to charge from a light source before it becomes visible. I played my flashlight across the surfaces, charging the paint, and then I switched off the light and waited for my eyes to adjust. The names appeared slowly, emerging from darkness like stars becoming visible after sunset. Hundreds of them covering every wall in neat columns, arranged alphabetically, each one followed by a date and a brief notation. They were death records, I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach. Names of people who'd died trying to cross this sector, documented with the date of their death and the location where their bodies had been found or where they'd last been seen. Some I recognized from official reports, cases I'd worked or heard about during briefings, but most were unknown to me, names that had never made it into our databases or missing persons reports, people who'd simply disappeared into the desert and been noted only by this secret archive maintained in an abandoned motel room by someone who felt compelled to ensure their deaths weren't forgotten. The notations were brief but specific. Maria Sanchez, 7/12/2015, 10 miles west of here. Heat exhaustion. Roberto Cruz, 3/4/2018, Rio Salado Wash, drowning. Lee Wei, 11/9/2020, Highway 9 mile marker 47, vehicle accident. On and on, column after column, year after year. A comprehensive record of loss that dwarfed anything in our official statistics. I stood there in the darkness, watching the names glow softly on the walls around me, and I understood why the message had said I would understand when I saw them. Because my own reports were here, cases I'd worked over the past 3 years, people whose deaths I'd documented and investigated and filed paperwork about. But they were mixed in with names I'd never heard, cases that should have been reported but weren't, deaths that had occurred in my sector during my shifts without my knowledge. That shouldn't have been possible. We had procedures, coordination with county medical examiners and sheriff's departments, systems designed to catch every incident and ensure it got properly recorded. But here was evidence that people were dying in significant numbers without entering those systems, slipping through gaps or being deliberately concealed or simply never being found. their bodies claimed by the desert and their names preserved only in this glowing archive that existed outside official channels. And someone, this LV who'd left messages for me, wanted me to see that, wanted me to understand the true scope of loss in this sector and my own participation in its incomplete documentation. I found the bathroom mirror where the message had directed me, a cheap rectangular mirror mounted above a sink that had long since disconnected from any water supply. I pulled it away from the wall, expecting to find more names, more records, but instead I found a hole in the drywall leading to a hollow space between the rooms, and inside that space was a notebook. A composition book with a black and white cover, the kind you'd buy in any school supply aisle, filled with handwritten entries in multiple languages, but primarily Spanish and English. I pulled it out carefully, took it into the main room where my flashlight could illuminate the pages, and began reading. It was a log, a detailed record of activity at this motel going back to the early 2000s, maintained by different people over the years but all following the same format. Date, number of people passing through, their conditions, what assistance was provided, where they were headed. The entries painted a picture of this abandoned motel functioning as a way station, a place where migrants could rest and access information and receive help from a network of volunteers or sympathizers who checked on the rooms regularly and maintained the maps and the memorial walls and the information systems that helped people survive their crossings. But the later entries, the ones from the past year or two, showed a pattern shift. The number of people passing through had dropped dramatically, and the entries began noting increased Border Patrol presence in the area, changes to patrol schedules, new sensor positions, details about our operations that were too specific and too current to have been obtained through passive observation. Someone was actively tracking us, documenting our movements and procedures with the same care they'd once used to document the migrants passing through. And the entries mentioning my name began appearing about 6 months ago, noting when I'd worked certain sectors, which routes I'd patrolled, what time I'd passed certain checkpoints. I was in this log, my patterns and habits recorded with precision, studied and analyzed by whoever was maintaining this place. The most recent entry, dated last week, said simply, Gideon Yarborough, Tuesday swing shift, Highway 9 sector. Careful, methodical, doesn't miss details. When he comes, and he will come, show him room 14 first. He needs to see the names before he can understand the rest. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking slightly, and tried to process what I was being told. Someone had been watching me for months, learning my routines, predicting my responses, and had arranged this entire sequence, the anonymous tip, the messages directing me from room to room, the revelation of the death records, as a way of communicating something they couldn't or wouldn't say directly. But what? That I was complicit in an incomplete accounting of border deaths? That the systems I worked within were failing to capture the true human cost of enforcement? That I needed to be aware of this hidden archive and the network maintaining it, even if I couldn't officially acknowledge its existence? I thought about Boaz Fenwick, the senior agent who'd mentored me when I first transferred to this sector, his frequent reminders that our job was fundamentally about saving lives, not just catching criminals. He'd retired last year, moved back to Virginia where his family lived, but we still talked occasionally, and I found myself wanting to call him, to describe what I'd found and get his perspective on what it meant and what I should do about it. But I didn't call. Instead, I put the notebook back in its hiding place, replaced the mirror on the wall, and walked out of room 14 into the brutal afternoon sunlight that made me squint and raised immediate sweat on my skin. Laurel was waiting near the vehicles with the deputies, and they all looked up expectantly when I emerged. I told them the rooms were clear, no people present, just evidence of historical use as a way station, nothing that required immediate follow-up. We photographed the exteriors, documented the location, and filed a report noting the abandoned motel's use by migrants and recommending periodic checks to ensure it wasn't being actively utilized for smuggling operations. Standard procedure, standard language. Nothing that hinted at what I'd actually found or the message that had been left for me in those rooms. I kept the details about the death records and the surveillance log to myself, uncertain what would happen if I elevated that information through official channels, worried that bringing attention to this place would destroy whatever fragile system had been maintaining it and deprive future travelers of the resources they apparently depended on. The county medic, Laurel Penhaligon, caught me before we left, asked if I was feeling all right, said I looked shaken. I told her I was fine, just the heat, just the depressing nature of abandoned places and the evidence of so many people passing through in desperate circumstances. She nodded sympathetically and didn't push, but I could tell she didn't quite believe me, could see that something about this call had affected me more than it should have. We drove back to the station in separate vehicles, the deputies taking the highway while I took the back roads, giving myself time to think, to process, to decide what to do with the knowledge I'd gained. The sun was setting by the time I reached the station, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I'd been in any state to appreciate them. I filed my report, logged my evidence photos, and went off shift without mentioning the notebook or the messages or the fact that someone had been documenting my movements with concerning accuracy. But I couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, I found myself driving past the Mesquite Motor Lodge during my patrols, always at different times, never obviously staking it out, just passing by and noting whether there was activity, whether vehicles were present, whether the rooms showed signs of recent occupation. I never saw anyone, never caught evidence of the network in action, but small things changed each time I visited. A new map would appear in room 11, or the death records in room 14 would include fresh names, or supplies would show up in other rooms I began checking. Room 3 with its cache of water bottles and protein bars, room 9 with its first aid supplies and blankets, room 12 with its charging station powered by a solar panel someone had mounted on the roof. The place was being actively maintained, carefully and consistently, by people who knew how to move invisibly through a landscape I thought I understood completely. And they knew I was watching, knew I was coming back, because occasionally I'd find small acknowledgments. A fresh message in room 7, always signed LV, usually saying something like, "Thank you for not reporting this," or "You understand now why it matters," or "The names need a witness, even if the witness can't speak." I did understand, or at least I understood enough to feel the weight of the choice I was making by not reporting the full extent of what I'd found. Every name on those glowing walls represented a failure of our systems, a death that should have been prevented or at least properly documented, and by keeping silent about the archive I was in some sense endorsing its necessity, admitting that our official processes weren't adequate to capture the true scope of loss in this sector. That was an uncomfortable truth, one that created ethical tensions I still haven't fully resolved. But the alternative, bringing attention to the motel, shutting down the way station, destroying the information network that was clearly helping people survive, seemed worse, more directly harmful, more immediately consequential. So I kept my silence, and I kept checking on the rooms, and I gradually became part of whatever quiet system was operating in that abandoned building, a reluctant participant in an infrastructure of survival that existed parallel to and hidden from the enforcement apparatus I officially served. Boaz Fenwick called me about 2 months after that initial visit, just a random check-in to see how I was doing, and somehow the conversation turned to moral complexity and the difference between following procedures and serving the deeper purposes those procedures were meant to serve. I didn't tell him specifically about the motel, but I described the general situation, finding evidence of a support network, knowing that reporting it would shut down resources that were saving lives, struggling with the conflict between my duty to enforce the law and my recognition that the law as written didn't capture the full moral landscape of border work. Boaz listened quietly, and when I finished, he was silent for a long moment before responding. "I'm going to tell you something I probably should have told you when you first started in this sector," he said. "There are systems running along this border that are older than the Border Patrol, older than the modern nation-state concept that defines what we do. Indigenous trade routes, family networks, survival knowledge that's been passed down for generations. Our job isn't to destroy those systems. Our job is to manage the space between them and the law, to make sure that when people cross, they do it safely, whether that means we catch them and return them, or whether it means we look the other way when doing so will prevent deaths. You're not failing by recognizing that complexity. You're just seeing the job clearly for the first time." I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, especially when I found myself at the motel documenting new names in room 14 or checking that the water supplies in room 3 were still fresh. I'd become part of the maintenance cycle, part of the quiet infrastructure, and I rationalized it by telling myself I was serving the higher purpose Boaz had described, preserving life even when it meant bending or ignoring certain procedures. But the surveillance log in that notebook bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The fact that someone was tracking my movements, studying my patterns, predicting my responses, that felt like a violation, even if it was being done by people whose broader mission I'd come to respect. Who was LV? How did they know my name before I'd ever visited the motel? How did they know I would be assigned to respond to their anonymous tip? Those questions nagged at me, suggesting a level of access to our operational information that should have been impossible, implying either a breach in our security or the existence of informants within the Border Patrol itself, people who were feeding information to the network maintaining the way station. I tried to trace the initials, running them against databases of known smugglers and volunteer organizations and humanitarian groups operating in the area, finding nothing that matched. I looked for patterns in the anonymous tips that came into our station, trying to find other calls that might have come from the same source, discovering nothing conclusive. And I watched my colleagues more carefully, looking for signs that someone else might be involved in this parallel system, finding only the usual mix of dedicated professionals and burned-out veterans that you'd expect in any Border Patrol station. If there was an informant, they were being extraordinarily careful, leaving no traces I could detect. Or maybe there wasn't an informant at all. Maybe the network had simply gotten very good at predicting our operations through pure observation and pattern analysis, learning to read our institutional behavior the way a good tracker reads sign in the desert. Either explanation was unsettling in its own way. Either one implied a level of sophistication and organization that challenged my assumptions about who controlled the operational landscape in this sector. The last time I visited room 14, about a week ago, I found a new message written in that now familiar blue marker. This one, longer than the others, taking up most of a blank space on the wall near the bathroom. It said, "Gideon, you've been coming here for almost 6 months now. You've seen the names, you've understood the necessity, you've kept our secret, and for that we're grateful. But you should know that you're not just a witness anymore. You're part of this now, part of the record. Your name is in the notebook, your patterns are documented, your choices have been noted. We watch everyone who comes to these rooms. We learn who can be trusted and who poses a threat, and we make decisions based on that learning. You've been trusted. Don't make us regret that trust. Keep the rooms safe, keep the names protected, and understand that there are others like you, other agents who've seen what you've seen and made the same choice. You're not alone in this. You're part of a longer tradition of people who understand that the border isn't just a line on a map. It's a lived space where the rules are more complex than any policy manual can capture. Room 3 needs water. Room 9 needs fresh batteries. Room 11 needs updated maps of the new sensor grid near Highway 81. If you can help with these things, help. If you can't, we understand. But know that your presence here is known, your assistance is appreciated, and your name will be remembered alongside all the others who've served this place. LV. I photographed that message, as I'd photographed all the others, creating a private archive that I keep on a drive that's never connected to official networks, never shared with anyone, just maintained as my own record of these strange months when I became something more and less than a Border Patrol agent. When I learned that the job contains multitudes and contradictions that the training never prepares you for. I did bring water to Room 3, did replace the batteries in Room 9, did provide updated sensor grid information in Room 11, not from official sources, just from my own observations during patrols, information that anyone paying attention could have gathered, but that I compressed and formatted in ways that would be useful to people trying to avoid detection. I told myself I was preventing deaths, that every person who used those maps to navigate safely around our sensors was one less person dying of exposure or dehydration in terrain that kills casually and often. But I knew I was also violating my oath, sharing operational information with people who were by definition violating federal law, becoming complicit in a system that undermined the enforcement mission I was supposed to be serving. The ethical weight of that choice is something I carry every shift, a constant, low-grade tension that colors every decision and makes me question whether I'm doing the right thing or just taking the path of least resistance, avoiding the harder choice of reporting what I know and letting the consequences play out as they will. I haven't been back to the motel in the past week, have been avoiding Highway 9 during my patrols, taking routes that keep me away from that stretch of abandoned borderland. I'm not sure why, not sure if it's guilt or fear or just exhaustion with the complexity of the situation, the weight of being watched and studied and positioned in systems I don't fully control. But I know I'll go back eventually, that I'll find myself at Room 14 checking the names, seeing if any of them are people whose deaths I documented officially, adding my own observations to the record that exists outside official channels. Because Boaz was right. This job is about more than following procedures. It's about serving the deeper purpose those procedures were meant to serve, which is preserving human life and dignity in a landscape that challenges both. And if that means maintaining silence about a way station, participating in an infrastructure of survival that operates parallel to the law, accepting that my name is in someone's notebook and my patterns are being studied by people I'll never meet, then that's the price of seeing the job clearly, of understanding the border as a lived space rather than just a line to defend. The names on the wall keep multiplying, new ones appearing each time I visit, each one a marker of failure. Our failure to provide safe crossing options, their failure to navigate the desert successfully, the shared failure of a system that creates conditions where people die trying to reach safety or opportunity or family. And LV, whoever they are, keeps adding to the record, keeps maintaining the rooms, keeps watching and documenting and making sure that when agents like me stumble into that place we see what needs to be seen. Understand what needs to be understood. I don't know their face, don't know their story, don't know if LV is one person or a dozen, or a longer chain of caretakers stretching back decades. But I know they're out there, moving through the same landscape I patrol, serving a different mission with different methods, but the same fundamental goal of preventing unnecessary loss. And I know that somewhere in their records, my name is written alongside all the others who've come to the Mesquite Motor Lodge and made the choice to keep its secrets, to participate in its quiet work, to become part of a tradition that's older than the badge I wear and will likely outlast it. a tradition of bearing witness to the border's human costs and trying, in whatever small ways are available, to reduce them. Room 14 is waiting. Room 7 has a new message I haven't read yet. Room 11 probably needs updated information I haven't provided. And somewhere in the darkness, LV is watching, documenting, maintaining this strange archive of loss and survival that I've become entangled with. I'll go back, probably tomorrow, probably alone during a quiet stretch of my shift when nobody will notice my detour off the main patrol routes. I'll check the names, provide what help I can, and add my own small contribution to a system that shouldn't exist but does, that fills gaps our official processes can't or won't address. And I'll carry the weight of that choice, that double life, that constant tension between the agent I'm supposed to be and the person I'm learning to become. The border keeps teaching, the desert keeps taking, and those of us who work this line keep trying to find the balance between law and mercy, duty and conscience, enforcement and preservation. Some days I think I've found it. Other days I'm certain I'm failing on all fronts. But the names keep appearing, and someone needs to see them, and right now, in this sector, that someone is me. That's the job I've inherited, the role I've been drafted into, and I'm still trying to understand whether accepting it was the most moral choice I could make, or just the easiest way to avoid harder questions I'm not ready to answer. Static from the scope, then Hollis Redwine's voice cutting through. Target acquired. 300 meters south-southeast of your position. Single individual moving north at walking pace. Thermal signature consistent with human, no visible cargo. I adjusted my night vision and swept the sector where he'd indicated, seeing nothing but the ghostly green outlines of Palo Verde trees and cholla clusters that dominated this stretch of California borderland, their branches creating a maze of shadows that made visual confirmation nearly impossible even with enhancement. This was the third night running I'd been posted at Observation Point 9. A rocky outcrop that gave a commanding view of a known smuggling corridor running parallel to the border fence, and so far we'd interdicted exactly nobody, intercepted exactly nothing, despite Hollis's field intelligence suggesting this route should be active. He was working from a command vehicle 3 miles north, coordinating multiple observation posts and analyzing movement patterns from sensor data and aerial imagery, feeding us real-time updates that should have made our jobs straightforward. Should have. But something about this operation felt off from the start. Felt staged in a way I couldn't articulate, as if we were being positioned deliberately rather than deploying tactically. The target Hollis had identified moved through a gap in the vegetation, and I caught a brief visual. Tall figure, moving with purpose but not speed, carrying what looked like a backpack or bundle of some kind. Standard profile for a border crosser, nothing that raised immediate flags, and I radioed my partner positioned 200 meters west to start moving to intercept while I maintained observation and called in support from the mobile unit running the perimeter. But as I watched, the figure stopped, stood motionless for a long moment, and then did something strange. They removed the backpack, set it on the ground with obvious care, and then walked away from it, heading not north toward deeper U.S. territory but east, parallel to the border, moving along a line that would take them directly into the densest part of the Palo Verde thicket where visibility dropped to almost zero and pursuit became a nightmare of thorns and unstable footing. I reported this to Hollis, asked if he was tracking the same movement, and he confirmed, said the thermal signature was now stationary near where the backpack had been left. Said the individual appeared to have gone to ground or found cover. "Hold observation," he said. "Let's see what they do next. This could be a pickup scenario." I kept my optics trained on the backpack, watching for any sign of movement, and that's when I noticed the reflection. Just a brief glint of light, there and gone in a fraction of a second, coming from somewhere in the thicket maybe 50 meters from where the figure had disappeared. I scanned with my scope, trying to locate the source, and saw nothing, but the feeling of being observed intensified. That primitive awareness that you're not the watcher but the watched, that you've been located and assessed by something you can't see. I was about to report the reflection when my radio crackled and a different voice came through. Etta Winthrop, the park ranger who coordinated with us on operations near the border wilderness areas. Border Patrol, this is Park Service. We've got a situation developing on the ridgeline northeast of your position. Multiple light sources, possibly signal fires or flares. Pattern doesn't match any authorized activity. Can you confirm you've got personnel in that area? I told her negative. All our units were accounted for and positioned along the primary corridor, and she acknowledged with concern in her voice. Copy that. I'm seeing at least 6 distinct light sources. They're appearing and disappearing in sequence, creating what looks like a directional marker pointing away from your observation posts. Somebody's either lost and signaling for help, or this is a diversion. Thought you should know. Oh. I thanked her and relayed the information to Hollis, who went quiet for a moment before responding. That's interesting. The lights are in the opposite direction from our target's movement, and they're positioned in a way that would naturally draw our attention away from the primary corridor. Classic misdirection. I'm thinking we've got 2 operations running simultaneously. A decoy to pull our resources one direction, and the real movement happening while we're distracted. Cormac, maintain your position. Don't pursue the figure that dropped the pack. Let's see if this develops into something we can action more effectively. But the lights on the ridgeline kept multiplying, and within 10 minutes Etta was reporting dozens of them, all moving in coordinated patterns, all creating directional markers that seemed designed to lead responding units away from the border and deeper into the wilderness. Hollis made the call to dispatch 2 units to investigate, while the rest of us held our positions along the corridor, and I watched through my scope as headlights swept across the desert, moving toward the ridgeline where the lights were dancing. And that's when the backpack moved. Not carried by anyone I could see, not touched by any visible person, just sliding across the ground as if pulled by an invisible line, moving steadily back toward the border fence at a pace that matched a slow walk. I reported immediately, said the package was in motion, said I had no visual on whoever was moving it, and Hollis's voice came back tight with confusion. Say again? You're not seeing anyone near that pack? I confirmed, said the pack was definitely moving, but I couldn't identify the means, and I started moving down from my observation point to get a closer look, hand on my sidearm, night vision amplifying every shadow into potential threat. The terrain between me and the pack was rough, loose rock and sand, clumps of desert vegetation, small washes that could turn an ankle if you weren't careful, and by the time I covered half the distance, the backpack had stopped again, sitting in the middle of a clearing maybe 20 feet across, perfectly visible in the moonlight. I approached it carefully, scanning the area with my light and my scope, seeing nothing, no tracks, no disturbance in the dust, no indication anyone had been near it. The pack itself was ordinary, a cheap hiking model in desert camouflage, the kind you could buy at any outdoor store or online retailer. I keyed my radio and told Hollis I was going to examine it, asked for clearance to disturb potential evidence, and he authorized it, told me to proceed with caution and document everything. I photographed the pack from multiple angles, noted its position and condition, and then I opened it. Inside, instead of drugs or contraband or supplies, I found rocks, just rocks. Desert stones of various sizes carefully arranged in layers, the pack loaded to feel like it contained something substantial when carried, but delivering nothing of actual value when examined. I stood there holding a fistful of stones trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and Hollis came on the radio asking for a status update. I described the contents, said this was clearly a decoy, and he acknowledged with frustration. Looks like they played us. The lights, the dropped pack, the thermal signature, all designed to hold our attention while the real movement happened elsewhere. Classic misdirection, and we fell for it. Cormac abandoned that position and moved to the ridgeline. Let's see if we can salvage something from this. But as I turned to move, I saw the reflections again, multiple ones this time, scattered through the Palo Verde thicket in a pattern that formed a rough circle around my position. Brief glints of light, appearing and disappearing in sequence, and with each flash I saw my own image reflected back, distorted and multiplied, as if I were being observed through multiple scopes or mirrors positioned throughout the vegetation. I keyed my radio and reported it, said I was being targeted or illuminated by something, and Hollis's voice came back uncertain. Targeted? Cormac, clarify what you mean. Are you taking fire? Are you seeing weapon signatures? I told him no weapons, just reflections, just the sense of being observed from multiple angles simultaneously, and there was a pause before he responded. That doesn't match any known smuggling tactic. Could be counter-surveillance, cartel scouts using mirrors or retroreflectors to track our positions. Get out of that clearing, move to cover, and we'll reassess. I moved, but the reflections followed, appearing ahead of me now, leading me deeper into the thicket along a path that seemed to open up naturally, the dense vegetation parting just enough to allow movement without forcing me to fight through thorns and branches, and I realized with a cold certainty that I was being herded, guided along a specific route toward a destination someone else had chosen. My movements anticipated and channeled with the same precision that had been applied to the fake backpack and the diversionary lights on the ridgeline. Hollis had been wrong about which direction the misdirection was pointing. The lights weren't pulling units away from the real crossing, they were pulling me specifically toward something else. Something that required me to be in a particular place at a particular time. I stopped walking, called in my position, and told Hollis I thought I was being led into a trap or ambush. He ordered me to hold the position and called for backup units, said he was redirecting the mobile patrol to my location. ETA 8 minutes, just sit tight and maintain defensive posture. But the reflections didn't stop. They intensified, appearing from every direction now, creating a cage of light around my position that made it impossible to see beyond the immediate vicinity. I drew my sidearm, swept my flashlight through the thicket, and called out standard warnings. Border Patrol, show yourself. This is your only warning. Receiving no response except the continued appearance of those glinting reflections that seemed to mock the idea of human presence or agency. And then they all vanished simultaneously, leaving me in total darkness, my night vision momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden absence of light. And in that moment of blindness, I heard movement, close, multiple sources converging on my position from different angles. I backed against a large Palo Verde trunk, tried to establish a defensive perimeter, and my vision cleared just enough to see them. Not people, not animals. Something between moving with a coordination that wasn't natural but wasn't mechanical either. Low profiles shifting through the vegetation in patterns that flowed around obstacles rather than confronting them directly. I counted 7 distinct shapes, maybe more, each one carrying what looked like handheld mirrors or reflective panels, and they were positioning these in a circle around my location, planting them in the ground or hanging them from branches, creating a ring of surfaces that would capture and redirect light in ways I couldn't immediately predict. I called it in, described what I was seeing, and Hollis's voice came back sharp with confusion. Cormac, you're not making sense. You're saying there are individuals setting up mirrors around your position. For what purpose? Are they armed? Are they threatening you directly? I told him I didn't know, said they weren't making any aggressive moves, just positioning equipment, and he told me backup was still 6 minutes out, told me to maintain observation and do not engage unless directly threatened. The shapes finished their positioning and then withdrew, melting back into the vegetation as smoothly as they'd appeared, leaving me standing in the center of a circle of mirrors, all angled toward my location. And then the light started. Not from the ridgeline this time, but from sources much closer, positioned throughout the thicket in locations I couldn't see. Powerful beams that hit the mirrors and reflected, creating a complex pattern of illumination that converged on my position from multiple angles simultaneously. I was lit from every direction, caught in a web of light that eliminated shadows and made depth perception nearly impossible, and I understood with sudden clarity what had been constructed here. A blind, not for hiding from observation, but for controlling it, for creating a space where the normal rules of seeing and being seen were suspended, where someone in my position became the observed rather than the observer, studied and documented rather than studying and documenting. I tried to move out of the circle, but the moment I took a step toward the perimeter, the light patterns shifted, creating barriers of illumination that made it painful to look in certain directions, that guided me back toward the center through pure sensory manipulation. Hollis was asking for status updates, his voice increasingly urgent as my responses became fragmented and confused, and I told him I was trapped. Told him I was being held in position by some kind of light-based containment system. Told him I needed immediate extraction. He acknowledged and said units were rolling hard to my position. ETA now 4 minutes, just hold on. And I tried to hold on, tried to maintain my composure in the face of something I had no training for, no procedural response to, no framework for understanding. The lights kept burning, kept shifting their patterns, and I became aware of movement at the periphery again. Those same low shapes circling just outside the ring of mirrors, observing my reactions, documenting my responses to their constructed scenario. And then I saw myself. Not in the mirrors, though those showed my image from every angle, but in the gaps between the beams where the darkness remained, where thermal imaging or night vision must have been positioned. I could see what looked like my own silhouette displayed on panels or screens mounted in the thicket. My movements captured and replayed in real time, creating a disorienting feedback loop where I couldn't tell which version of myself was real and which was reflection. I spun slowly, trying to track all the images simultaneously, and Hollis's voice cut through, asking me to describe what I was experiencing. His tone shifting from tactical concern to something else, something that sounded almost like recognition. Cormac, listen to me carefully. What you're experiencing right now, other agents have reported similar scenarios in different sectors. This is documented. This is known. I need you to stop moving, stop trying to escape, and just stand still. Let them finish their observation. Fighting it only extends the duration. I asked him what the hell he was talking about, who they were, and he said he'd explain when I was extracted, but right now I needed to trust him and remain calm. They're not going to hurt you. They're just documenting. It's a counter-surveillance operation, probably cartel-affiliated, studying our responses to entrapment scenarios so they can refine their tactics. If you stay calm, if you don't escalate, they'll disengage once they have what they need. I told him that was insane, that nothing about this matched cartel behavior, that the level of coordination and technology required to construct this scenario suggested something else entirely. But he insisted, told me backup was 2 minutes out, told me to just hold position and wait, and I did, because I had no other option. Because the light cage around me was too disorienting to navigate, and because some part of me recognized that Hollis was right. I was being studied, not threatened, observed as data rather than confronted as an opponent. The lights went out all at once. The same simultaneous termination I'd seen before. And the mirrors were gone when I swept my flashlight through the area. No physical evidence they'd ever been there except for small depressions in the dirt where stakes might have been planted. The shapes had withdrawn completely, leaving no tracks I could find, no sign of their passage except my own scrambled memories of being watched and documented. Backup units arrived and swept the area, finding nothing, and I was escorted back to the command vehicle where Hollis was waiting with an expression I couldn't read. He debriefed me in private, asked detailed questions about timing and sequence, and my emotional responses to the various stages of the scenario, taking notes on everything I described. And then he told me something that made my skin crawl. This has happened 6 times in the past 8 months across 3 different sectors. Same pattern. Agents are led to specific locations through elaborately staged misdirection, isolated using light-based techniques, and then subjected to intensive observation for periods ranging from 5 to 20 minutes before being released unharmed. We don't know who's running these operations or what their ultimate goal is, but the working theory is that someone, probably cartel-affiliated, possibly foreign intelligence, maybe even domestic anti-border groups, is studying our field responses, documenting our procedures and reactions under stress, building a comprehensive database of how Border Patrol agents behave in unusual scenarios. The mirrors, the lights, the thermal imaging. It's all about data collection, about learning how we think and react so that information can be weaponized against us in future operations. You were tonight's subject, Cormac. You were the data point they needed to complete some larger analysis. I asked him why this wasn't common knowledge, why we weren't being briefed on these incidents, and he said the decision had been made at sector level to contain the information, to avoid creating panic or paranoia among field agents. If everyone knows they might be targeted for observation, they'll start second-guessing every call, seeing threats in every shadow, and operational effectiveness will collapse. Better to handle these incidents quietly, debrief the affected agents thoroughly, and use the information to improve our own counter-surveillance procedures. I asked if I was being taken off patrol, and he shook his head. No reason to. You've been through the experience now. You know what to watch for. And that actually makes you more valuable for certain operations. But you need to understand that this wasn't random. They chose you specifically, Cormac. They studied your patrol patterns, learned your responses, and constructed a scenario designed to test specific aspects of your decision-making. That means you're on someone's radar, someone's list of agents worth documenting. That's not a comfortable thing to know, but it's reality now. I went home that night and couldn't sleep, kept seeing those mirrors arranged in their circle, kept feeling the weight of observation from multiple angles, kept trying to make sense of why anyone would invest such resources into studying a single Border Patrol agent's responses to an artificial scenario. Hollis's explanation made logical sense. Data collection for future tactical advantage. But something about it felt incomplete. Felt like it was covering for something else he either didn't know or wasn't authorized to share. The precision of the operation, the sophistication of the light control, the way those shapes had moved through the vegetation like they were part of the landscape rather than visitors to it. None of that matched cartel behavior or foreign intelligence methodology. It felt different, felt like something older and stranger. Like I'd been subjected to a ritual or a test rather than mere surveillance. I started digging through reports from other sectors, using access credentials I probably shouldn't have to pull up incident records mentioning unusual observation scenarios or light-based containment techniques, and I found more than Hollis had indicated. Not 6 incidents, but 18, going back 3 years. Each one documented with varying levels of detail, but all sharing common elements. Agents led into isolated positions surrounded by reflective surfaces, subjected to intense illumination from multiple angles, released unharmed after a period of observation. And in each case, the affected agent had been working a specific type of operation, responding to intelligence suggesting smuggling activity along a known corridor, positioned where they would have a commanding view of the border, but would also be isolated from immediate backup. The scenarios were too similar to be coincidence, too precisely replicated across different times and locations to be independent events. Someone was running a systematic program, targeting Border Patrol agents for some purpose that went beyond simple tactical intelligence gathering. And the deeper I dug, the stranger the patterns became. Several of the affected agents had left the Border Patrol shortly after their incidents, taking early retirement or transferring to desk jobs, citing stress or health concerns. 2 had filed reports claiming they experienced ongoing surveillance, feeling watched during off-duty hours, noticing small changes in their homes suggesting someone had been inside while they were absent. 1 had disappeared entirely, listed as AWOL after failing to report for a scheduled shift. Their vehicle found abandoned near one of the documented observation sites with no sign of struggle or foul play, just absence, as if they'd simply walked away from their life and vanished into the desert they'd been patrolling. These follow-up patterns weren't mentioned in any official analysis I could find, weren't referenced in the briefings Hollis had given me, just scattered through individual agent reports and personal logs that suggested the mirror incidents were starting points rather than isolated events, that being selected for observation had consequences that extended well beyond the immediate experience. I called Hollis a week later, asked him directly about the long-term effects, whether the agency tracked agents after they'd been subjected to these scenarios, whether there was any pattern to what happened to them afterward. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That's not something I can discuss over unsecured channels, Cormac. But if you're experiencing ongoing concerns, if you're noticing anything unusual, you should document it and report through the proper channels. There are resources available, support systems in place for agents who've been through traumatic incidents." I told him this wasn't about trauma. This was about wanting to understand what I'd actually been subjected to, who had done it and why. And he cut me off. "You're overthinking this. It was a surveillance operation. You were studied for tactical purposes. It's over now. Move on, maintain your professionalism, and let the counterintelligence people do their jobs. That's my advice, and I'm telling you as someone who's been where you are. Digging deeper on this will not improve your situation. It will just make you paranoid and less effective at the job you're supposed to be doing." But I couldn't let it go. I started varying my patrol patterns, avoiding the observation posts I'd been assigned, requesting different sectors and different shifts so I wouldn't fall into predictable routines. And I started noticing the reflections everywhere. Not the obvious mirror setups from that night in the Palo Verde thicket, but subtler signs of observation. Light glinting off surfaces that shouldn't be reflective. Brief flashes in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I looked directly at them. The sense that I was being photographed or recorded during routine patrols in areas that should have been empty. I reported some of these observations, got told they were probably just natural phenomena, or my imagination working overtime after a stressful incident. Got advised to take some personal days and decompress. But I knew what I was seeing, knew the feeling of being watched, and I understood that whatever had been done to me that night in the thicket wasn't over, that I'd been marked in some way, selected for ongoing attention by whoever was running these operations. Etta Winthrop reached out a month later, asked if we could meet informally, said she had some concerns she wanted to discuss away from official channels. We met at a diner in town, and she told me she'd been experiencing similar issues, the sense of being watched, the unexplained reflections, small things in her ranger station that seemed to have been moved or examined when she was certain she'd left them secured. It started after that night when I reported the lights on the ridgeline, she said. I don't think that was coincidence, Cormac. I think calling in that report connected me to something, made me visible to whoever's running these observation operations, and I think they're not done studying us. She'd done her own research, had found patterns similar to what I'd discovered, and she'd reached a conclusion that made a disturbing kind of sense. It's not cartels, she said. It's not foreign intelligence. This is domestic, this is organized, and it's been running for years, maybe decades. Someone or some group has been systematically documenting how federal agents operate along the border, building comprehensive profiles of our procedures and responses, and I think the goal is something beyond simple tactical advantage. I think they're trying to understand how our systems work, how we think, so they can eventually replace or circumvent those systems entirely. I asked her who would have the resources and motivation to run an operation like that, and she shook her head. I don't know specifically, but think about who benefits from comprehensive knowledge of border enforcement procedures. Not smugglers. They just need to know routes and timing, not detailed psychological profiles. Not foreign governments. They have better ways to gather intelligence. This feels more like someone who's planning for a long game, someone who needs to understand every aspect of how the border works before they can implement whatever their actual plan is. Maybe it's a domestic group planning some kind of action against federal presence in border regions. Maybe it's something else entirely. But the fact that agents who've been through these observations start dropping out of service, start disappearing or leaving the field, that suggests whoever's running this has follow-up protocols, ways of ensuring that the people who've been studied most closely don't remain in positions where they could interfere with whatever comes next. We agreed to keep in touch, to share information if either of us learned anything new, and to be careful about who we trusted with these concerns. And then I went back to my patrols, back to my assigned sectors, trying to maintain professionalism and effectiveness while carrying the weight of knowing I was being watched, studied, documented for purposes I couldn't identify. The reflections continued, always at the edge of perception, always just brief enough that I couldn't capture them on camera or prove they were anything more than optical effects. Hollis checked in periodically, asked how I was doing, always with an undertone that suggested he knew more than he was saying, that he was monitoring my psychological state as much as my operational performance. And I played along, gave him the answers he wanted to hear, maintained the facade of normalcy while privately tracking my own observations, building my own database of unusual incidents and patterns. 3 weeks ago, I found another backpack. Different location, different circumstances, but the same setup. Pack sitting in an open clearing, loaded with rocks, positioned where it would draw attention and require investigation. I didn't approach it this time, didn't fall for the same pattern twice. Instead, I called it in, marked the position, and maintained observation from a distance while backup units responded. And I watched as the scenario unfolded exactly as it had before. The pack moved when no one was near it. Reflections appeared in the surrounding vegetation. Diversionary lights manifested on a nearby ridgeline. But this time, I wasn't the target, wasn't the one being herded into position. Another agent, someone newer to this sector, responded to the scene and got channeled into the same kind of light cage I'd experienced, got subjected to the same intensive observation while command coordinated extraction. And I realized I was watching from the outside now, seeing the pattern from a different perspective, understanding how precisely orchestrated these scenarios were and how thoroughly they'd been designed to study specific aspects of agent behavior. The new agent was debriefed the same way I'd been, got told the same story about cartel surveillance and data collection, got advised to move on and maintain professionalism. And I wondered if they'd follow the same trajectory I had, if they'd start noticing the ongoing observation, if they'd eventually reach out to people like me and Etta looking for answers that command either couldn't or wouldn't provide. The cycle seemed designed to be self-perpetuating, to create a population of agents who'd been through the mirrors and knew they were being watched, but couldn't discuss it openly without being labeled paranoid or unstable. We were being isolated, divided, kept from comparing notes in any systematic way, and that isolation served someone's purpose, ensured that we couldn't mount any kind of collective response or investigation into what was really happening in these scenarios. I'm writing this from my current observation post, 3 hours into a quiet shift, watching empty desert under a moonless sky, feeling the familiar weight of observation that never quite leaves anymore. The reflections haven't appeared tonight, but I know they could. Know that at any moment the pattern might reassert itself and I'll find myself herded into another scenario, subjected to another round of documentation and study. Hollis would tell me I'm being paranoid, that I should take personal leave and decompress, that focusing on this is making me less effective at my actual job. But I can't shake the conviction that understanding what happened that night in the Palo Verde thicket is more important than any number of routine patrol operations, that whoever's running these observations has a larger plan that goes beyond simple intelligence gathering, and that the affected agents, the ones who've been through the mirrors and marked for ongoing attention, are positioned in some larger strategy we can't perceive from our current vantage point. Etta sent me a message yesterday, said she'd identified 12 other agents and rangers across multiple sectors who'd experienced similar incidents and showed similar patterns of ongoing observation. She's trying to organize a meeting, informal and off-record, where we can compare notes and pool our knowledge, see if we can construct a more complete picture of what we're dealing with. I'm planning to attend, though I'm also aware that gathering us in one place might serve whoever's watching us better than it serves our purposes. But what's the alternative? Keep working in isolation. Keep carrying the weight of being studied and documented without understanding why or by whom. At some point, you have to take action, even if that action carries risks, even if it might be exactly what you're being herded toward. The desert is patient, the mirrors are precise, and somewhere in the darkness beyond my observation post, the shapes are moving through their patterns, positioning their equipment, preparing for the next scenario when another agent will be selected and studied and marked. I'm part of that pattern now, whether I want to be or not, and the only choice left is whether I accept that position passively or actively work to understand and potentially disrupt whatever system I've been incorporated into. Hollis would say I'm making a mistake, that I'm seeing conspiracy where there's just routine counterintelligence, that I should trust the agency to handle whatever threats exist and focus on my assigned duties. But I've been through the mirrors, I've seen how precisely we're being studied, and I can't pretend anymore that this is routine, or that the official explanations capture what's really happening along this border. Something else is operating here, something that's been running long before I arrived, and will likely continue long after I'm gone, and the only question that matters is whether I can figure out what it is before I become just another data point, just another agent who experienced the mirrors and then disappeared into whatever comes after observation, whatever fate awaits those of us who've been selected and studied and found to match whatever criteria drives these operations. The shift ends in an hour. I'll file my routine report, log my observations, maintain the professional facade, and then I'll drive to wherever Etta's organized the meeting, and I'll compare notes with the other agents who've been through what I've been through, and together we'll try to build a picture from fragments, try to understand the whole from our limited perspectives. Maybe we'll find answers, maybe we'll just create more questions, but at least we'll know we're not alone, that the mirrors selected more than just us individually, that we're part of a larger group whose experiences can be pooled and analyzed in ways that might reveal patterns invisible from any single vantage point. That's something. That's more than nothing. And right now, In this sector, on this shift, with the weight of invisible observation pressing down from all directions, it's all I've got to work with. So I'll work with it, and I'll see where it leads, and I'll accept whatever consequences come from refusing to look away from what I've seen, from insisting that the mirrors matter, that understanding who built them and why they were arranged around me is worth more than any number of routine patrols along a border that's being watched and documented by forces I'm only beginning to perceive. The notebook was wedged beneath the spare tire in a 2008 Ford Explorer we'd pulled over near the Falfurrias checkpoint, hidden in a space so deliberate and precisely cut that it took Nevin Caldera's flashlight and 20 minutes of methodical searching to find it. The vehicle itself had come up clean on every scan. Registration current, no warrants, driver cooperative to the point of nervous politeness. But there was something in the way the man had gripped his steering wheel, knuckles pale against the worn leather, that made me signal for secondary inspection. It was 3:47 in the afternoon, the South Texas brush country shimmering in heat waves that turned the horizon into liquid, and I'd been working this sector long enough to trust the feeling that crawls up your spine when something doesn't match the pattern you've learned to recognize. The driver had given his name as Roberto Salinas, shown us a Texas ID that passed every verification test we ran, explained he was heading to Houston for construction work and had nothing to declare. He'd answered every question with the kind of careful precision that legitimate travelers use when they're aware that any deviation from absolute honesty might cause problems, and nothing about his story raised immediate flags. But Nevin had noticed the faint outline of dust on the rear cargo area carpet that suggested something heavy had been removed recently, and when we'd asked permission to search more thoroughly, the man's cooperation had shifted from polite to resigned, in a way that told us we were going to find something, even if we didn't yet know what. The Explorer had been meticulously cleaned, wiped down with the kind of attention that goes beyond ordinary maintenance, and that level of care itself was a marker worth noting. People who haul legitimate cargo don't usually sanitize their vehicles like crime scene cleaners preparing for luminol testing. The notebook was small, maybe 5 by 7 inches, bound in cracked leather that had been handled so many times the cover had worn smooth in places. The pages inside were filled with handwriting in 2 different scripts, one neat and careful, the other hurried and angular, and as I flipped through it standing there in the harsh sun beside the highway, I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't exist in any rational operational security framework. It was a ledger, but not the kind you'd find in any legitimate business. Each page contained dates, grid coordinates, names or initials, and dollar amounts, along with notations in Spanish and English that used terminology I recognized from briefings about human smuggling networks. Polo for migrants, Coyote for smugglers, Pasador for guides, and, most disturbingly, Perdido next to certain entries. Lost. The coordinates were what made my hands go cold despite the 96-degree heat. I knew these routes, I'd patrolled them. Some of the grid references matched locations where I'd conducted vehicle stops or responded to sensor activations over the past 18 months, and seeing them written in this careful script made me feel like I'd been performing in a play without knowing there was an audience taking notes. Nevin was on his phone coordinating with the task force by the time I reached the page dated 7 months earlier, the notation reading FM 2360, 1940, AR passed, the unit south. I remembered that night. I'd been running a checkpoint on Farm Road 2360, had let through a contractor's van after a brief inspection that revealed nothing suspicious, and had thought nothing more of it. But according to this ledger, that van had been carrying 6 people in a compartment I'd failed to detect, and someone had documented my failure with the kind of clinical precision that suggested they'd been close enough to observe the entire interaction. The notation included my patrol unit number and the timestamp accurate to the minute, which meant whoever compiled this information had either been watching through optics from a distance, or had access to radio traffic that should have been secure. The realization that my movements had been tracked and recorded, that I'd become a documented variable in someone's smuggling calculus, created a sensation like cold water spreading through my chest. I told Nevin what I'd found, showed him the entries that corresponded to our operational patterns, and watched his expression shift from professional interest to the kind of focused concern that comes when a case stops being abstract and becomes personal. He took photos of every page with his department phone, the shutter sound clicking in rapid succession as he documented evidence that would eventually make its way through intelligence channels to federal prosecutors. And then he carefully placed the notebook in an evidence bag that he sealed and labeled with the methodical attention that critical discoveries demand. The driver, Roberto Salinas, was already in custody by then, sitting in the back of a patrol unit with his hands cuffed and his head tilted back against the seat, staring at the roof with the blank expression of someone who's accepted that whatever he'd been trying to accomplish had failed. Nevin would handle the interview, would work through the formal questions that procedure required, but we both knew the notebook itself was the real intelligence value here, not whatever explanation the driver might offer. Back at the station 3 hours later, after the paperwork had been filed and the evidence logged, and the driver transferred to county holding pending federal charges, I sat in the break room with the photos Nevin had forwarded to my phone, scrolling through page after page of documented crossings that painted a picture far more comprehensive than any single investigation had revealed. The ledger went back 19 months, covering a period that included my entire tenure in this sector, and the entries showed a level of operational sophistication that contradicted the common narrative about disorganized smuggling attempts by desperate individuals making poor decisions. This was systematic, professional, and most unsettlingly, it was adaptive. The routes changed in response to our patrol patterns. The timing adjusted when we shifted checkpoint hours, and there were notations indicating when certain agents were on duty, suggesting someone had profiled our individual approaches to enforcement and tailored their operations accordingly. One entry from 4 months ago stopped me cold. AR, Solo, 0230, Bravo 9 sensor, delayed response. It was referencing a night when I'd been running single-agent patrol due to staffing shortages, had received a sensor alert in a remote section of ranchland, and had taken longer than usual to respond because I'd been dealing with a disabled vehicle 20 miles away. The notation included my call sign, the time of the sensor activation, and a remark about the delayed response that suggested they'd been monitoring our radio communications in real time and adjusting their crossing to exploit the gap my absence created. 6 people had crossed that night according to the ledger, moving through terrain I should have been covering, and I'd never known about it until now. The entry also included a small notation in the margin. Guard knows the land, careful approach. That phrase, guard knows the land, suggested they'd studied my patrol habits enough to recognize I was familiar with the terrain and wouldn't make obvious mistakes, which meant their planning had to account for a higher level of opposition than they'd face with less experienced agents. I thought about Ora Litchfield, the highway patrol officer who'd assisted with a traffic stop 2 weeks earlier, when we'd intercepted a suspected smuggling vehicle that turned out to be clean. She'd mentioned seeing the same pickup truck on 3 different nights, always around 2 a.m., always heading south on Highway 281, and at the time we'd noted it in our reports but hadn't connected it to any larger pattern. Now, looking through the ledger, I found multiple entries referencing Scout 281 southbound, with times that matched Ora's observations exactly. The pickup wasn't smuggling anyone. It was conducting reconnaissance, mapping our positions and response times, feeding information back to coordinators who used that intelligence to plan crossings that would avoid interdiction. The sophistication was impressive and deeply disturbing, because it meant we weren't just dealing with opportunistic smugglers. We were up against an operation that treated border enforcement as a problem to be studied and solved through systematic intelligence gathering. Nevin called around 8 p.m., his voice carrying the strain of someone who'd spent hours in an interview room getting nowhere. "Salinas isn't talking," he said. "Lawyered up within 10 minutes. Hasn't said a word since except to confirm his name. But we got a warrant for his phone records and residence, and the task force is putting together a target package based on the ledger contents. You need to see something, though. We cross-referenced the coordinates with incident reports going back 2 years, and there's a pattern that lines up with your shift rotations almost perfectly. Whoever's running this operation has been tracking you specifically, Ansel. They've got your schedule, your patrol routes, your response patterns. The ledger is basically a field manual on how to avoid Agent Rook. That information should have made me angry. Should have triggered the kind of professional outrage that comes from discovering you've been surveilled and countered by criminal networks. But instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion, mixed with a strange sense of inevitability. Of course they were tracking us. Of course they were adapting to our methods. The idea that border enforcement was a one-sided game where we held all the advantages had always been naive. But seeing the evidence of just how thoroughly they'd studied us made the naivety impossible to maintain. I asked Nevin if there were entries for other agents, and he confirmed there were. Everyone working this sector had been documented to some degree, but my call sign appeared more frequently than anyone else's, which suggested either I was particularly effective and therefore required more attention to counter, or I had patterns they'd found especially predictable and exploitable. Neither interpretation was comforting. The next shift I worked, 3 days after the Explorer's seizure, I found myself second-guessing every decision in a way I never had before. When sensors triggered in a pattern that suggested eastward movement through a mesquite thicket, I wondered if it was genuine traffic or a diversion designed to pull me away from a real crossing happening somewhere else. When a vehicle at the checkpoint answered all my questions correctly and had documentation that verified perfectly, I wondered if that perfection itself was a red flag, if they'd studied my inspection patterns enough to know exactly what responses would satisfy my scrutiny. The paranoia was corrosive, turned every routine interaction into a potential setup, and I recognized the psychological impact was probably worse than any tactical disadvantage the surveillance had created. An agent who can't trust his own judgment becomes paralyzed by doubt, and paralysis in this work meant opportunities missed and threats undetected. The entries marked Perdido, Lost, kept drawing me back when I looked through the photos late at night. There were 11 of them, scattered through the ledger, each with just a name or initial, a date, and that single word. No explanation of what lost meant in this context, whether people had been separated from groups and never found, whether they'd died during crossing and been left behind, whether they'd been abandoned when they couldn't keep pace, or whether something else entirely had happened that the coordinator felt warranted documentation. The ambiguity was haunting because it represented people who'd been reduced to accounting notation, problems that disrupted the smooth flow of operations and were recorded for future reference, the same way the ledger tracked our patrol patterns or route conditions. Those 11 people, whoever they were, had paid thousands of dollars to be smuggled across the border and had instead become single-word entries in a criminal accounting book found wedged beneath a spare tire. One of the Perdido entries was dated 9 months earlier, listed only as MR 0417, Sector 7, and I spent hours trying to match it to incident reports from that time frame. We'd found remains in Sector 7 around that period, skeletal, partially scattered by animals, impossible to identify without DNA analysis that Immigration Services had requested but never gotten results for. Could have been MR, could have been someone else entirely. but the timing and location matched well enough that I felt reasonably certain we'd recovered whoever that notation referenced. The fact that the smuggling network had documented the loss but hadn't reported it, hadn't tried to trigger a search, hadn't done anything except note it in their ledger as a data point, spoke to the cold operational logic that governed these networks. People were cargo that sometimes got lost, and lost cargo was a business expense, not a crisis requiring intervention. 6 weeks after the seizure, surveillance teams reported observing the same patterns resuming in our sector: sensor activations that suggested coordinated crossings, scout vehicles on Highway 281 in the early morning hours, and trash dumps at staging areas that indicated groups were moving through the territory again. The operation had reconstituted itself, adapted to account for our increased awareness, and resumed business with barely a pause. We'd seized one ledger, arrested one coordinator, and disrupted operations for maybe a month before the network filled the gap and continued. It was exactly what Nevin had predicted, exactly what I'd known intellectually would happen. But seeing it play out in practice still created a sense of futility that was hard to shake. The ledger itself sits in an evidence locker downtown, photographed and cataloged and referenced in ongoing investigations, but effectively inert now that the network has moved past whatever intelligence it contained. The coordinates are already outdated, the patrol patterns it documented have been deliberately altered, and the operational details it revealed are being used to build cases that will take years to prosecute even if they succeed. Meanwhile, new ledgers are probably being compiled right now, documenting our current patterns with the same clinical precision, adapting to our adaptations in an endless cycle of move and countermove that characterizes all enforcement work against motivated, organized opposition. I still think about that notebook, about the careful handwriting documenting crossings and coordinates, and my own movements with equal attention to detail, about the perdido entries representing people who'd become footnotes in a criminal enterprise, about Roberto Salinas sitting in county holding, refusing to talk, protecting a network that had probably already replaced him and moved on, about the fact that every shift I work now gets documented somewhere by someone, that my patrol patterns are being studied and countered in real time, that the game of border enforcement is being played by opponents who've done their homework and know the territory as well as I do. The desert doesn't care about any of it. The brush country keeps its secrets, holds the remains of people marked perdido in ledgers that may never be found, and provides cover for crossings that happen in the gaps between our patrols. And we keep working, keep interdicting what we can, keep pretending that the occasional successes add up to something more than temporary disruptions in a flow that continues regardless of our efforts. The ledger showed me the truth of that in a way no briefing or statistics ever could, and now I can't unsee it. Can't go back to the comfortable assumption that we're winning more than we're losing. Some nights when the desert is dark and the sensors are quiet and I'm alone on patrol in territory I thought I knew, I wonder who's out there right now, updating their ledger with fresh entries about Agent Rook's patterns and movements, documenting my work the same way I document theirs, in an endless accounting of a border that refuses to be controlled no matter how carefully we try to track it.